Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Gabe Jones from Proprio, as Henry said. This will be an exciting one. First of all, the founder gets to interview the investors, which is fun. I promise to be mostly nice. The topic is a timely one, right? It's the subject of verticalization of AI. It's AI touching everything in healthcare. And you've got investors who come from technical and clinical backgrounds and who understand both medical device and the entire spectrum of the continuum of care. So I think we're well situated here. Quick poll. If you were to identify yourself as either a bull, bear, or undecided regarding AI, please vote. So bulls on AI? Okay. Bears? No bears. Wow, I don't know if I believe that, but undecided, that's okay too. One undecided in the back. Okay. I don't know if we're going to convert you today, but we'll try. So first, a thought construct that I've been kind of mulling over in this moment in time that we're in right now in AI. And this is not my quote, so I'm stealing it, but hopefully it frames up the conversation. First, humans, in terms of our brains, are equipped with what you might call a Paleolithic brain, right? Developed for a different time and different applications. We've also developed institutions that you might refer to as medieval. So think medieval institutions, hint, hint, healthcare. But now we're equipped with what you might call godlike technologies, right? Just think about that context and how much chaos that could generate, depending on your position regarding AI. So in that context, I'd love to start with you, Alex. You shared a great framework for thinking about this particular moment in AI in healthcare that we talked about a week or so ago on our prep call. If you could start with that and then maybe link that to the opportunities and the uniqueness of this particular moment in AI in healthcare.
Sure. So, I've been working in AI and biomedicine and healthcare for actually 20 years now, which is saying a bit, but, many kinds of real dramatic new tech innovation do take some time. And, in practice, things are mostly actually an S-curve, but the first part of an S-curve is an exponential. And the early part of an exponential, not a lot is going on for a very long time until suddenly things really start to accelerate. And over the last couple year or year and a half or so, things have very clearly accelerated, and many things that were not working suddenly have flipped over to being effectively fairly commoditized as technologies. To give you an example, automatic transcription, taking a patient-clinician encounter in a medical clinic visit and turning that into a structured medical note, things weren't quite working despite years of work. 2 or 3 years ago, nothing really worked. Most clinicians would be satisfied with the product. And suddenly, it's effectively a commoditized technology now. And to some extent, that was some of the advantage has been driven by one of our portfolio companies, OpenAI. But they're not the only ones able to do this. It's just things have really converged. And that timing and that excitement around things in AI actually both creates commodity units of technology, right? Because everyone's always building on the shoulders of giants for the next generation. And as soon as we can take some of these things and suddenly say things weren't working, and suddenly they are working, but everyone actually can get access to something that works pretty well or good enough for most applications. And certainly with language, we seem to be there for many applications of how people think about using generative AI for language. For 2D images, we're like, let's say 70, 80% of they are in certain niche applications. I think we're effectively solved to where we need to be. And then I think we're going to, kind of maybe talking about an area we haven't crossed over. We aren't in the world of really the convergence or the crossover point to what we might talk about in near term, large physical models, where you would basically have systems that suddenly can act in the 3D world in the kind of way that we're now seeing things like ChatGPT interact with people. And that has a second aspect where that enthusiasm and that general recognition actually creates a lot of interest at the enterprise level. So, just pick an area like radiology, right? AI and machine learning systems have been better than community radiologists at many tasks, interpreting mammogram, for example, identifying intracranial bleed. They have been better than community radiologists for a decade. There just wasn't any real adoption or recognition. And then suddenly, things have really switched over. And you look at a company like Rad AI, they are now accelerating and getting a ton of adoption with a tool that is supporting radiologists in their work with AI. And accelerating time to complete a note, making sure nothing's missed. So we're in a really great period for people that are building technology to take advantage of all this kind of crossover point where now things that weren't working suddenly are, and then building the whole next generation of tools and services and technology on top of that.
Excellent summary. Akhilesh, you want to go next and maybe talk from the perspective of an investor, but also a clinician, you're an MD, how AI in this particular moment is impacting you, how you're looking at investments as an investor, but also you have that very unique and valuable perspective of a clinician. If you could maybe bridge that gap for us.
Yeah, definitely. I think Alex raises a lot of the points that we're spending a lot of time thinking about. And one of the things that I think is particularly interesting is the fact that some of these technologies do commoditize very quickly. And that's, I think, unique in the context of healthcare because historically a lot of innovation cannot commoditize quickly because it's protected by hard IP for devices, drugs, et cetera. But that's changing. And so I think that raises questions for companies that we have to answer as investors, things around how can a company capture the value for an innovation that it creates before others come along? How does it stay differentiated? What is defensible about it? One of the things that I think is linked to that is thinking about what does the market opportunity look like? And if you end up facing pricing pressure, for example, can you still sustain an interesting business? And then the last piece of it, which is also related, is just figuring out how these business models work, because with the technological innovation happening so fast, it's difficult for the business models, the reimbursement environment, all of those things to keep up. And so can a company figure that out before moving on to the next thing or the next product? I think from the clinical perspective, it's a very exciting time because so many of these things are transforming how care can be delivered. One thing that I think that companies and investors also need to think about is how to bring clinicians and physicians along. When you look at how physicians are reacting or the surveys that are done of them now, a lot have a lot of interest in AI solutions, but also feel a lot of caution about what it's going to mean for who's ultimately making decisions about patient care, what it does to the doctor-patient relationship, what it means for patient privacy. And I think if companies are not very sensitive to those concerns, there's going to end up being pushback from the people who ultimately need to adopt it and support it.
Let's come back to that adoption question, especially with clinicians, as we go back through the topics here. Debbie, you have a unique perspective. You're a clinical bioinformaticist, which is hard to say. The PhD was probably harder to get. You've been on the strategic side of the equation. Now you're at T.RX, and you're somewhat on the other side of the table in some of those conversations. If you could speak to the strategics, how they're thinking about this moment, as well as sort of the intersection and the kinds of companies that maybe you're seeing are possible to succeed or more likely to succeed in this environment, I think that'd be a nice bridge.
Yeah, I mean, I was long time, 15 years with a strategic, with a pharma company, and then ended up leading their CVC for digital health. And at the time, this was, five-ish years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, pharma, I have not seen, so recently there's a news, and I know that we were talking about Lilly being at the forefront of pharmacy, delivering pharmacy direct to consumer with Amazon Pharmacy. We would never have thought about that in terms of direct to consumer patient delivery of medications from a pharma company at all 4 or 5 years ago. That's one. Second, NVIDIA and Relation, which is a drug discovery AI platform, and Deerfield investing together, Deerfield and NVIDIA investing together into this drug discovery. Deerfield, a very traditional biotech fund, and NVIDIA, normally don't see that kind of marriage, but very, very interesting. So I think there's a lot there in the market signaling a lot of excitement around AI. To Alex's point around radiology images, the data is very important, and I think we'll talk about that in a bit. Standardized data. Radiological images are standardized. It comes through PACS, easy to kind of calculate over, compute over. So that cleanliness and the quality of the data is very, very important. So similar with language, right? You have conversations, we understand that, and we can read in that information and be able to compute over that. Now, when we think about making the leap over to clinical outcomes, if we think about algorithms or drug discovery, That's a little bit longer. So I think when we evaluate companies or technologies, really need to look at the kind of data, the proprietariness of the data, as well as the capability to really deliver clinical outcomes and actionable insights in a meaningful and efficient amount of time that can be commercializable, so that there is a economic value today or shortly. So those are my main points.
That's great. Thanks for teeing that up. Armen, you have a unique perspective in being in a larger investment group and then going out on your own and raising money to invest in the space. So clearly you have passion and a thesis around the area. You've also been in the OR as the rep interacting with the physician and the clinical team. If you could speak to kind of the inefficiencies there in the sales operations environment in med device, traditional, and how this moment might start to change those kinds of interactions.
Sure. Yeah, we are truly at an inflection point. And I say that because way back in the day, if I had said that an algorithm could demonstrate clinical significance, people would have laughed at me. In fact, I think they did, not with me, at me. And, we are now seeing that real artificial intelligence can demonstrate that it can detect disease, produce images reliably, and guide physicians to better clinical outcomes. That's great. The challenge that we see, in attending a lot of the sessions here this week, in hearing about how the med tech industry is embracing innovation and AI, and that is great, but to really achieve the breakthroughs in the OR, to have people picking this up at a faster clip, we have to restructure, really rethink about how it is we're delivering these technologies to patients. And by that, I specifically mean people like me who are standing in the OR, because people like me cost an annual estimated about $35 billion a year in sales operations costs. That's a figure, in full disclosure, of several different med tech companies' estimates of what they spend. $35 billion is what Chase Capital One just paid for Discover, right? It's a lot of money. And we, as an industry, I say we from, I used to be in it, really have traditionally thrown people at the problem, right? How do we have somebody standing in there in the OR training somebody to do a procedure? And I think that we've really got to think about how artificial intelligence and other technologies associated with it can really enable the physician or other caregivers like nurses, medical assistants, and so on, to more effectively have a clinical outcome and get there on their own without that. But that really requires us rethinking how it is a medical device company is structured, its business model, where that revenue comes from, and some of those underlying structures. And that's why my firm and others and my peers in the industry really believe that a lot of the breakthrough companies are going to come from startups unencumbered by that previous model.
That's a great segue. Alex, I'm going to tee you up here and put you on the spot. If you could talk a little bit about how your interaction and discussion with strategics is different now in this moment. That's tagging off of what Armen just said about the likelihood of a large strategic being able to transform into an AI company, quote unquote, and the unique opportunity that startups have to position themselves at this moment for potential partnerships in the future with strategics.
Well, I mean, every large strategic organization right now has some kind of spun up an AI strategy group or an innovation team at this point. Now, but they're large organizations, and so actually, interesting that you ask, because they do reach out to us because we were big investors in things in AI. But if I were to, some groups will move very quickly. Clearly, Microsoft has really leaned in. Other organizations are not moving nearly as quickly. And we are at one of those major periods where there is a kind of tidal wave of tech innovation happening, and many things are up for grabs. The future isn't written. And it's people in this room who are going to actually determine how the future bakes out. And it's going to take a lot of work, but one of the advantages of being a small company is you have the agility and the ability to try something and the ability to move quickly, and you don't have to have C-suite initiative and report and then a decision to allocate funding and resource it. You can just start doing things. And as Armen mentioned, one of the key things is the scaling property of software, right? So traditionally in healthcare, problems have been solved by throwing labor at the problem. And that scales sublinearly in that quality doesn't quite scale linearly. You have to have other managers. There's a lot of organizational. Any change then becomes harder and harder to roll out organizational change because it requires behavior change and training. Well, technology, of course, is much easier to scale. Hardware, there are economies of scale in manufacturing, great properties, although there are huge upfront costs in tooling, manufacturing, and then it can be quite hard to pivot too much once you have hardware technology. Software can still have significant innovation costs, upfront costs to build, but then the marginal cost of scaling is usually near zero. Now, currently with a lot of AI technology, it's expensive to do compute, but that might be 10 cents per episode of actual scaling, as opposed to a hardware that, again, you're trying to roll out billions of an item, if it costs $1, $2, $5 to manufacture, and then of course the all-in cost of shipping and distribution and so forth. Software has very easy distribution, very easy marginal scaling costs, and also quality improvements can often be very easily pushed out. And so your product gets better as a function of scale, which is a really unique thing. So again, the greater scale you're at, the greater rationale you have for additional investment in improving it. Whereas for human infrastructure, trying to improve it gets harder as a function of scale. Software, your product, it gets better the more it's distributed and used. And that's a very unique property. And so, much of healthcare is, to Armen's point, involves interaction, it is, human to human, all kinds of stuff where the scaling properties are terrible, so the quality at scale is terrible, the cost at scale is terrible, all kinds of things get inverted in a world where a lot of that quality and value creation shifts to AI and software.
Love it. If you could continue, Akhilesh, from that clinician's perspective, what moves the needle for adoption to drive that initially inefficient process, but then much more scalable process, as Alex alluded to?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I think the reality is that the adoption doesn't move as fast as the technology does. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple reasons for that. I think one is building trust, so making sure that the clinicians feel comfortable with the new technology as it comes along. I think the second thing that is going to become, is something that needs to be figured out more and more as some of these models come along, is the regulatory environment. Mm-hmm. So I think the FDA has interacted with a lot of algorithms at this point, but they do tend to be closed algorithms. You kind of get what the inputs and outputs are going to be. As some of those systems advance beyond that, there's going to be need to be new frameworks that are developed. And then the third thing I think is payment. We've alluded to this already, but how some of these technologies get paid for is still a work in progress in a lot of cases. All of those things I think are very addressable. But they're the pieces that I think cause adoption to be a bit slower. Once you work through them, I think that there is going to be rapid adoption and scaling. The value that these things create in terms of workflow efficiency, clinical outcomes is apparent, and so there'll be a lot of interest.
Mm-hmm. Someone from Mayo yesterday, a physician on a panel, said something to the effect of AI doesn't drive change management in healthcare, data does. That's a clinician saying that. I think that's an interesting frame of reference for what you just said, which is, clinicians want to see data and proof, to your point as well, before I bring that product into my workflow. And I think that's what that person was alluding to. But from a technologist perspective, we would say, great product. Whether AI is under the hood and does this or that or the other thing is what really drives change from a user behavior adoption perspective. That's at least our opinion. Anybody got an opinion on driving adoption among clinicians with AI-driven products? Going to open it up to the panel to talk about that.
I think it goes back again to clinical, actionable, meaningful insight at the point of care. If you can create with AI this capability to make a decision quicker and help a patient faster, and they can see it, and people want to pay for it, or the payers want to pay for it, absolutely.
Could you extend that thinking, because of your unique perspective, into the actual product development process. So whether that's new drug discovery and development, companies like Recursion come to mind, where they've got both public and private data sets, and now they're running their own internal sort of foundation models to simulate the drug development process faster, so that different employees within their ecosystem can sort of run simulations of new molecule development much faster and cheaper.
Yeah, so I was asked when a company says I can do that and I have this new algorithm, show me. And a lot of times it's very hard to show me. And they'll tell me, okay, well, I can make this incremental, I can validate incrementally. I can make molecules that look like a set of molecules that was made before. And I'm like, well, okay, so what? And they show me something different, but then you need to take it to clinic, or you need to take it into a mouse, and that takes a long time. So I would say that there's still question marks around. Certainly, there are combinations of molecules you could make now that probably never before have been made because of the capability to compute over this space. But you still need to put in a mouse, and you still need to put in a human, and that takes that
Data
takes a
and
long
proof,
time.
yeah. Armen, could you talk a little bit to the founders and people running early stage companies in the audience? And this will also be watched by other people post facto, so think about that audience. How founders should be targeting data sets, products, applications that will drive the kind of adoption that then becomes very valuable in the marketplace, both for M&A, acquisition, and exits. How should founders be thinking about using these tools to establish that initial foothold that Alex was alluding to?
Sure. So I think that when I meet with a lot of founders, one of the questions that often presents itself is, you have something that's really great for a physician to use, or it's got some novel aspects to it. There's a lot of whiz-bang factor, but really nailing on the head, what is the problem exactly it's solving? We see a lot of things which would be incrementally nice, which some physicians would find that could be a nice to have in their day. But you got to think about physicians' amount of time per patient, especially when you're looking at GPs. It's 8 minutes they have per patient. Various other specialties have limited interaction with the actual patient, or it's a person lying in front of them. So you got to really think about, how is that going to, A, produce that clinical outcome, but second, how is it going to be transparent to the physician as to how you're getting what you're getting? A lot of the hesitation I saw early on in adoption was because it really wasn't obvious how you got the answer. If you diagnose somebody, or there was an outcome you were trying to guide them toward, they didn't know why, and they felt that they were driving blindly with whatever it is, the robotics they were given. So it's got to be transparent. Thinking about things in steps, augmented reality before full-on robotics, to just trust. Thinking about presenting an image that is subject to an interpretation by the physician that they like to do, because that's what they went to school to do, as opposed to, we're going to take that away from you. So really think about their day, their needs in the product, and how it is that it's going to make their jobs more fun.
I like that. That's actually a good segue. Alex, if you could talk a little bit about sort of your thoughts and framing up the entire industry and how things are moving with respect to that human in the loop, be it a clinician perhaps in this case, or another key contributor to an actual decision in the healthcare economy, where, yeah, it's great to take a foundation model and throw it at a data set, but the human in the loop reinforcement learning human feedback, or LHF, might be the most value added. Also, we want a clinician in that workflow, like Akhilesh, validating that decision from a reimbursement perspective as well. We have to have that. Could you talk a little bit about that intersection?
Well, the last point that you made about reimbursement does presuppose a bunch of things, which you may not necessarily be taking a typical reimbursement route for many of the things you deliver, and there are a lot of other paths, right? Self-insured employers in the US have been very early adopters of a lot of digital innovation and more that's becoming AI technologies, right? So we have a company, Sword, that does at-home physical therapy, and they have they're mostly getting most of their traction with self-insured employers. They are getting, they're really leaning out on how you use AI to improve that product experience. It's easy to focus on physicians as the group that you're trying to interact with, but of course they're only a tiny fraction of the human beings involved in the biomedical industrial complex, right? Armen mentioned, drugs, basically drug development companies spend 1.7x on sales and marketing they do on development. Okay, well then there are companies like Komodo, which is maybe, again, I'm not involved with Komodo, but I'll just use that as an example. It's kind of an old generation AI company, but they've been able to really move the needle and say, we will help with reducing cost or making the ROI on your sales and marketing spend much more efficient. Telephony, still much of medicine involves telephony, right? People call in, try to do scheduling. If you look at what a Poly AI can do with an AI agent that you interact with that seems very empathetic, very patient, will spend lots of time talking to you, most people can't actually tell that, a couple of years ago, you would call up FedEx to ask a tracking number. It's very clearly you're talking to a machine. There are systems now where the average person cannot tell that it is not a human being that's interacting with them. And there are lots of opportunities in healthcare where when you have an industry which is 17% of the economy, there's room for thousands of billion-dollar businesses to provide a ton of value. And many paths, we don't have to necessarily think about traditional reimbursement routes. There's lots of money available. There's lots of well, the other way to look at it is there's lots of value creation and value providing opportunities. And if you position them in the way that Armen described, you really have to make sure that you're actually helping someone and that you realize that there's a human decision maker on the other end that you would need to make it feel like you're helping their job and their position in the organization improve by bringing a product to them. If you can solve that, there's tons of opportunity. Now, there are cases where there are digital diagnostics, digital therapeutics that are taking an FDA-regulated approach, right? Companies like Wobot's doing clinical trial for postpartum depression with a chatbot. There are many applications where people are taking AI's medical device route. AliveCore in IDX were some of the earliest companies to go through FDA with AI as a diagnostic tool. And all that's an opportunity too. But there's not just one template for any of these things. And there's just, especially for an early stage company, you don't have a major, large incumbent labor force. You typically don't have a lot of CapEx in real estate. You have a lot of opportunity to try to move quickly and take advantage of any innovation and build on top of that. And there's lots of opportunity to build and create value for stakeholders.
Love it. If any of the rest of you could speak to how you're seeing proprietary data, as we discussed before the panel, plus these kinds of tooling actually linked together to add differentiated value. So whether that's, like I used the recursion example of public patent data on existing molecules plus private data, cameras and sensors on assays, on microscopes, et cetera, literally at the benchtop, to enable a bench scientist to perform like a chief science officer, if you will, in terms of simulating molecule development and applications like that. Obviously, I'm biased because I think proprietary data is very valuable in the clinical settings, so much so that I've built systems to go get those data to build other things. Any interesting ideas or companies you've seen lately who are leveraging data, in particular data they are acquiring or accessing in unique ways to build things?
So full-time, I work for Caris Life Sciences. I think you might all know Tempus as well as a company, former Groupon founder, so same space. They started as IHC companies, molecular diagnostic profiling companies. Over 14 years, I'll just speak for Caris, sitting on a mountain of data. And so now it's no longer, well, it is still molecular diagnostics bread and butter, but you've got a whole set of data that you're sitting on that you're leveraging and productizing and selling to pharma and all of that. So these companies evolve. I wouldn't call it strategic. It's pre-IPO, both of these companies. But companies evolve and they change, and when you can sort of leverage the data set that you built and then productize it in an experience or a product that people would pay for, I think that would be an example.
I know that this isn't a med tech example, but I think it's still illustrative for the audience anyway. I and a colleague led an investment in a company in my prior firm called Recursion, which uses machine vision to watch cells retreat from diseased into healthy states. And when we took a look at them in their earliest stages in a small lab in Utah, one thing that we noticed was, with extraordinary attention to detail, they had these plates on which they conducted all of these experiments. And they were initially starting with monogenic diseases, and they watched how it is that it impacted certain cell functions that they expected to see. And one day, their experiments were off inexplicably. And they went through everything, and they couldn't figure out, and they said, you know what? They said, I think something about the Petri dishes we're using is different. So they called the Petri dish manufacturer. Like, imagine, Petri dish manufacturer getting a call from a startup in Utah asking if they did something differently with the Petri dishes. This is a crank call, right? And they said, sure enough, yes, the dye we're using is different. And they made them give them the old Petri dishes. It was in that moment that we knew that we wanted to invest in this company. So it's that attention to detail around understanding what you have, getting to the bottom of why it's so important that you have data that is really great and consistent and pure. That led to, later on, an investment from NVIDIA, because who else's data would you use? I think in medtech, what you need to know about that data, the question is, if I'm going to say that data is valuable, I need to know what the data is going to be valuable for, right? How is it going to either steer me to, if I have a bunch of surgical data, is it applicable to a clinical circumstance? What's my proof? What is my audience going to ask of me to do it, right? So that's how I think about it.
Love it. Akhilesh, could you speak to data, proprietary data, the value of it, and at MVM, now putting on your investor hat, how you guys think about those opportunities for companies claiming to build something valuable with a proprietary data set, for example?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'll make a statement that is maybe obvious, but I think still worth saying. I think that a lot of the companies that end up having very valuable proprietary data are companies that were able to collect that data because they were doing something else. Maybe it was putting sensors in the OR, so they have very unique surgical data.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes. I think that where we see a lot of companies trip up from the investing mindset is they go looking for existing data sets and try to make those proprietary. And so we'll hear companies say things like, I have exclusive access to data from X large health system, and so that's a proprietary data. It may be proprietary, but it's not unique because there will be lots of other large health systems. And so I think that when companies are thinking about what makes data truly proprietary and special, they need to think about what do they have that no one else has, and as Armen said, how's that useful?
Actually, can I add something? Because it's even there. In some cases, it's worse than that. In that the value of data for things in machine learning is typically logarithmic, right? Let's say you have 10 data points. To get the same lift, you then need 100, and then you need 1,000 and 10,000. And if you were in any way spending linearly to collect that data, that is a divergent function, and that is not a path to success. Now, there are special cases where you get a monopoly of all of the data of a category, and that has some advantages, but that's a very important property that many people forget when they're trying to obtain a data moat. And the other key thing is many data types also massively depreciate very quickly. So for example, if you're very cutting edge with a new sequencing modality, if we're back on the cost-cutting curve for sequencing, so that data asset starts to depreciate very rapidly. Foundation models that people are investing, why NVIDIA has this money to invest in recursion, those foundation models that are being trained depreciate incredibly rapidly. And so if you're not able to catch the winning edge and build the kind of winner-take-all scenario, you are burning money without really creating intrinsic protectable value for your company. And I think that's where some companies get their data acquisition strategy incorrect. It is great if you're, for example, being paid to collect proprietary data, like you're doing something and you're collecting data in the in the operating theater. That has value. Google's the classic example of a company that built a great data moat because they were making money with everyone clicking in the early days and giving PageRank feedback, and so they, got an advantage that companies like Bing and Microsoft couldn't catch up with. But that they're not all data acquisition and strategies are the same, and there is very clearly a unit economics to data in its value and its cost.
Love it. With about 5 minutes left, I've got 2 different clocks and they're off by a minute, so we're just going to go by the average here. Could you talk a little bit about, for the startups in the room and checking out the feed later, and the strategics on the other side of that, what is it startups can do at this moment with these technologies and these data opportunities to position themselves, one, to be able to establish that initial position in the market to show that value, be it with a clinician or in a workflow or with a sales operations force, to take enough of a position, of the right kind of position in the market, such that one of 2 things can happen, right? The strategic then goes, oh shit, that's going to impact our existing business in a way that we should have a reaction to that, either partnering with that group or maybe acquiring, or that you can carve out enough of a niche to be a sustainable and growing business despite the downward pressure from really powerful incumbents in the space who have massive sales forces and workforces. Open to the panel. How do you do that at this moment in time?
Product market fit, right? I mean, so that's very different for products and categories, and so that's a classic issue. And most the other frame that is implicit in what you said is actually most small companies really struggle to get a product that the consumer has the ability to pay and money to spend, and the decision maker to actually be like, this is the product I need. And if it is true, many companies struggle with adoption. But if you cross over and figure it out and good product design, in many cases, people would say, oh, you'll never get adoption, and suddenly you do. Like I mentioned Rad AI, because we were investors 10 years ago in a company called Zebra, one of the first AI radiology companies. They really struggled. Times change, Rad AI figured out exactly the product they needed to build, zips along, gets tons of adoption.
Yep. That's actually, maybe I'll reframe the question better. Thank you for that. What is product market fit? How is it different now, and how are you measuring it or seeing it in this context?
Yeah, so something I always say is who is the user buyer, who's the financial buyer, and who's the technical buyer, and are those 3 people often the same person? So when I think about product market fit, is the person benefiting from your technology the person who's paying for it? I mean, I saw this recently in my own family where I could have benefited from a lot of these information workflow things that I see coming my way, but I'm not the one paying for it. So, absent that, no one's going to do it, and I just get to continue to bang my head against the wall. But Alex is completely right that it's all about that product market fit, and I think that if you're thinking about opening up some medical devices to new users or allowing an existing user base to do something a lot more easily and have a seamless experience and get to be something that's their essential tool and partner in the OR, then you have something that people are going to want. The same things that apply to consumers apply to physicians and hospital systems as well.
I have just a bit to add to both of my colleagues here. Product market fit, but also to Alex's point, look for non-traditional buyers. And you need to paint a vision or an experience that might not, he was saying, you don't have to go the traditional reimbursement model. Life insurance, for example. There were test cases or pilots that if you're a smaller startup, you might want a partnership. Paint a vision with potentially, the reason why I talk about life insurance is traditionally it wasn't the sort of payer that one might go to sell a digital health device or a wearable device, but they care about people's health and making sure that people are well in their course of their life. So potentially you could pair up with life insurance in helping with diabetes, a pharma company, digital health, wearable, whatever. And these are sort of stakeholders where you might not necessarily pair with a payer that you might not necessarily have thought so before. So just be creative is my point.
Akhilesh, you want to bring us home?
Yeah, I think that there's all good points. I liked what Alex said about how data gets old. I think it's characteristic of the fact that there is a condensed life cycle to innovation in a lot of these technologies, and what that means is that it's faster iteration. Companies need to stay ahead of things and move a little bit quicker, perhaps. But ultimately, the business fundamentals of finding product market fit, demonstrating value, I think all of those things remain the same with these technologies, and yeah, it's always worth remembering that.
Perfect. If this clock is to be believed, then we are right on time. If that one, we got 30 seconds. But thank you all very much. Thank you.
It was great.